Alden Corby had spent enough years being underestimated that he had stopped flinching when it happened. Life after Alma's death had a way of stripping a man down to his foundations, and what Alden had discovered underneath all the grief and the exhaustion and the years of doing everything alone was something simple and unshakable. He just kept going. Every morning before sunrise, before the coffee finished brewing, before his 12-year-old son Kit had even stirred in his bed upstairs, Alden unlocked the front door of Corby Electronics Repair on Merchant Street in Dunmore, Vermont, and started his day. The shop was modest. A converted ground-floor space in a building that had been a hardware store 40 years ago, then a shoe repair, then nothing for a decade before Alden signed the lease with hands that were steadier than his bank account. The workbench along the back wall was long and cluttered in a way that looked like chaos but wasn't. Every tool had a place. Every component sorted into labeled drawers Alden had built himself over 3 winter weekends. A single window faced the street. In the morning, when the light was right, it came in at an angle that made the whole room look warmer than it actually was. Dunmore was the kind of small town where people still propped the door open to talk to the postman. Population just under 3,000. One coffee shop, a grocery, a diner called Kemp's that had been there since 1962. The kind of place where everyone knew Alden by name, and most of them, at some point, had walked through his front door with something broken. He had opened Corby Electronics 9 years ago, 2 years before Alma got sick. They had built it together in the early days. She handled the invoicing and the customer calls, he handled the actual work. When she was diagnosed, he handled everything. And when she was gone 4 years ago now, he kept the shop because it was the one place in the world that made complete sense to him. Put something broken in his hands, give him enough time, he would fix it. Kit usually came in after school and did his homework at the small desk in the back office. Close enough to ask questions, but far enough to stay out of the way. He was a quiet kid, careful with words in a way his mother had been, and he had grown up understanding that his father's work required concentration. Some afternoons he would glance up from his textbooks and watch Alden work without saying anything for 20 minutes at a stretch. Just watching. Alden noticed this and said nothing about it, because he understood it completely. On a Tuesday afternoon in October, with Kit at school and the shop empty except for a ceiling fan that needed a new capacitor, a silver Porsche Cayenne rolled to a stop against the curb outside. Alden looked up from his workbench. The woman who stepped out moved with the deliberate efficiency of someone who had learned to treat every room like a boardroom. Diane Stover was 41, CEO of Stover Vance Media, a company that produced branded content and digital campaigns for Fortune 500 clients out of their headquarters in Boston. Her coat was wool and clearly expensive. Her expression suggested she had already decided this was going to be a waste of time. She pushed open the front door and set a matte black laptop case on the counter before Alden had the chance to say good afternoon. 3 Apple stores and 2 specialty shops in Boston couldn't fix this, she said by way of introduction. Someone in town told me you might be able to. Alden set down his screwdriver. What's the problem? The hard drive is locked. It won't boot. The data is critical. I have a presentation in 4 days that depends on files on this machine. He asked her a few questions. She answered them with the clipped precision of someone who had learned just enough technical language to talk around a problem without understanding it. Alden opened the case, examined the machine for 30 seconds, then asked if she'd had any prior repairs done on it. She thought about it. Someone in my IT department tried to replace the M2 drive last month. Alden nodded slowly. He already had a suspicion. I'll take a look, he said. Give me some time. Diane glanced around the shop as if cataloging it. The worn linoleum floor, the hand-lettered sign above the door. The shelf of old radios Alden kept for no practical reason other than that he liked them. Whatever she concluded, she kept it to herself, pulled out her phone and sat down on the bench near the window to wait. 40 minutes later, Alden called her over. He showed her the issue on the open machine, a bent connector pin on the M2 slot, barely visible to the naked eye, damaged during the previous repair. It had prevented the drive from seating properly. The data wasn't corrupted, it was perfectly intact. He had straightened the pin with a tool thinner than a sewing needle, reseated the drive, and the machine had booted on the first try. Everything's there, he said, Fonder's files, all of it. Diane stared at the screen for a moment. Then she looked at Alden. Something passed across her face, something that might have been relief, or might have been the beginning of recalibration. He handed her the invoice. She took it without looking, then looked. The number was $340. There was a pause, then a short sound that wasn't quite a laugh. You're charging $340 for 40 minutes of work? For the diagnostic, the repair, and the data recovery, yes. She set the invoice back on the counter with 2 fingers as if returning something that didn't belong to her. I pay my IT department more than that per hour, and they actually have degrees. Alden held her gaze. He kept his voice level. With respect, your IT department is what bent the connector pin in the first place. The air in the room changed. Diane looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up the laptop, slid it back into the case, zipped it, and tucked it under her arm. I'll send someone with payment, she said, though her tone made clear that was not a promise. She walked out, the door swung shut behind her, the bell above it rang once. Alden stood at the counter and did not move for a few seconds. He listened to the Porsche engine turn over, listened to it pull away from the curb and disappear down Merchant Street. The shop went quiet again, just the ceiling fan and the distant sound of someone's dog barking 2 blocks over. He looked at the invoice still sitting on the counter. He picked it up, clipped it to the board above the desk, and went back to work. He didn't notice the rental sedan parked across the street. He didn't notice the man inside it, who had watched the entire exchange through the plate glass window and had not yet started his engine. Kit arrived at 4:15 with his backpack slung over one shoulder and a half-eaten granola bar in his hand. He dropped into the chair at the back desk and pulled out his science textbook, then stopped. Dad, that lady left. She did. Did she pay? Alden paused over the workbench. Kit was quiet for a moment. Are you going to call someone? Alden looked up at his son, 12 years old and already asking the right questions. Alma would have smiled at that. No, he said. Why not? Alden set down his tools and thought about how to explain something that he himself had only come to understand over years of living. Because chasing someone who doesn't want to pay changes who you are in the process, and that costs more than $340. Kit looked at him with the expression he got when he was turning something over carefully. That doesn't seem fair. It isn't, Alden said, but fair and right aren't always the same thing. Kit picked up his pencil and went back to his textbook. He didn't ask anything else, but the line of his shoulders said he was still thinking about it. Across the street, the man in the rental sedan finally started his engine. But he didn't drive away for another minute. He just sat there, looking at the lit window of the shop, watching a man return quietly to work. His name was Hugh Stover. He was 68 years old, founder of Stover Capital Partners, worth somewhere in the neighborhood of $4 billion depending on the quarter. He was in Dunmore because an old college friend lived 20 minutes outside of town, and he had stopped on Merchant Street to check his messages before their dinner. He had been sitting in that spot entirely by accident when his daughter's Porsche had pulled up to the curb. He had watched all of it. Hugh sat with the engine running for a long moment, his phone untouched in the console. Then he picked it up and dialed a number he knew by heart. Grant, he said when the call connected, I need you to look into someone for me. Grant Faber had been Hugh's attorney and quiet fixer for 15 years. He had fielded stranger requests than this. Who? A repairman in Dunmore, Vermont. His name is Alden Corby. He runs an electronics shop on Merchant Street. A pause. What are you looking for? Hugh watched the light in the shop window where the silhouette of the man had returned to his workbench. I want to know who he is, not his credit score. Who he actually is. The following morning was like every other morning in Dunmore, except that Grant Faber arrived in town in a plain gray rental car and spent most of the day walking around asking quiet questions. He started at Kemp's Diner, where the woman behind the counter had lived in Dunmore for 40 years and knew everyone's business without making it her business. She told Grant that Alden Corby had fixed the diner's point-of-sale system twice in the last 3 years and had refused payment both times, saying it was too small a job to charge for. She said this with the matter-of-fact certainties of someone reporting the weather. He walked to the elementary school, where the principal told him that the previous January, the school's 3 classroom computers had crashed simultaneously due to a corrupted network update. The district's tech budget had already been exhausted. Alden had come in on 2 consecutive Saturdays and restored all 3 machines himself, bringing his own parts at no cost to the school. He didn't even tell anyone he was doing it, the principal said. He just showed up. Grant stopped at the fire station, where a captain named Morrison said that Alden had come out twice in the last 2 years to repair emergency communication equipment that couldn't wait for the county tech contractor. Both times after hours. Both times at no charge because, as Alden had put it, he wasn't going to invoice the fire department. But it was the pastor of a small church on Birch Hill Road who told Grant the story that made him go quiet for a moment before writing it down. 4 winters ago, a family named the Quincy's had lost most of their home to an electrical fire in February. Insurance covered the rebuild, but the electrical rewiring, a complex, expensive job, fell into a gray area the adjuster disputed. The family had 2 young children and nowhere to stay. Alden had shown up on a Friday afternoon with a truck bed full of materials he'd sourced at cost from a supplier, and he had rewired the entire house over 3 weekends, alone. He had never submitted a bill. He had told the Quincy's it was taken care of and not to worry about it, and when they pressed him on what that meant, he said only that someone had helped his family once when they didn't have to, and he was just passing it along. When Grant asked whether the Quincy's knew who had paid for the materials, the pastor smiled. "I don't think they ever found out it was him." Grant called Hugh from the parking lot outside the church. "Well," Hugh said, "he's exactly who you thought he was when you watched him." "And financially?" Grant paused. "The shop barely breaks even. He's been carrying a second mortgage since his wife died. He's 1 bad month away from real trouble." Hugh was silent for a moment, and yet he still. "Constantly," Grant said. "I didn't find a single person who had anything negative to say. One woman said her only complaint was that he never charges what he should." For the first time in a long week, Hugh laughed. That evening, back in his hotel room in Burlington, Hugh sat at the desk and spread out the documents he had been carrying in his briefcase for 3 years. A foundation structure, a trust, the draft papers for the Stover Community Initiative, which he had funded, organized, and staffed with lawyers and administrators, but had never launched because he couldn't find the right person to lead it. He had looked in the obvious places first: nonprofit executives, community organizers, social entrepreneurs. He had found competent people and credentialed people and ambitious people. He hadn't found the person he was looking for. He had begun to think in the way that men of a certain age sometimes do, that the person might not exist. Hugh's own father had been a textile worker in western Massachusetts, a man who worked 10-hour days and came home smelling of machine oil and never once complained about it. He had raised Hugh to believe that dignity was not something the world gave you. It was something you chose every single day, regardless of what the world was doing. The repairman who had fixed their family car for free when Hugh was 19, when his father couldn't afford the bill and had gone to the shop to explain, had changed the course of Hugh's life in ways that still rippled forward 50 years later. His father had kept that job. That job had meant a stable house. A stable house had meant Hugh could finish school. He had wanted to build something in that spirit for a long time. He signed the final pages of the trust documents. Then he picked up the phone and called Grant back. "Set up the meeting," he said. The morning it happened was a Thursday in October, the kind of morning Dunmore did well. Clean sky, the maples at peak color, wood smoke from a chimney somewhere on the hill. Alden had the shop open at 6:30. Kit came in before school to drop off his forgotten math worksheet and lingered at the doorway for a moment, looking at the invoice still pinned above the desk. "You still haven't taken that down," he said. Alden glanced up. "Not yet." Kit looked at him. "Are you still upset about it?" Alden thought about the honest answer. "A little, but not the way you'd think." He turned back to the circuit board in front of him. "The money stung. I'm not going to lie to you about that. But what I keep thinking about is that she looked at this shop and made a decision about what I was worth before she even knew my name." He paused. "That's the part that stays with me." "Because it was wrong?" "Because she'll do it to someone else," Alden said, "and whoever that is, they'll have to decide how to carry it, same as I did." Kit was quiet for a moment, then, "How do you carry it without it making you mean?" Alden looked at his son. "Your mom used to say you can't control what comes at you, you can only control who you are when it arrives." He smiled, the kind that came slower now than it used to. "I think about that a lot." Kit stood there another second, then said he'd missed the bus and ran. At 9:45, 3 black SUVs turned onto Merchant Street. Dunmore was not accustomed to convoys. People stopped. A man walking his dog paused at the corner. The woman from the florist 2 doors down stepped out to look. By the time the vehicles parked in front of Corby Electronics, a small knot of curious residents had gathered at a respectful distance, trading low voices. The door of the lead SUV opened. A man in a dark suit stepped out and opened the rear passenger door. Hugh Stover emerged, silver-haired, unhurried. He straightened his jacket and looked at the shop window for a moment before walking toward the door. Alden was at the workbench. He heard the bell above the door and turned. The man standing in his shop was not anyone he recognized, but something about the way the man carried himself, not with arrogance, with weight, the weight of someone who had been making significant decisions for a very long time, made Alden set down his tools. "Good morning," Alden said. "Can I help you?" I think you can, Hugh said. My name is Hugh Stover. I'd like a few minutes if you're willing. Alden recognized the name a half-second later, the kind of name that showed up in financial news in the business sections he sometimes skimmed while the coffee cooled. He kept his expression neutral. All right. They sat in the back office. Hugh looked around at the small space, at the photograph of a woman on the shelf, smiling at the camera from what looked like a summer afternoon somewhere with tall grass. At the child's drawing thumbtack to the corkboard above the desk, at the stack of invoices held together with a binder clip. I need to tell you something first, Hugh said. What happened here on Tuesday, my daughter's behavior was unacceptable. I want you to know that I know that. Alden went still. Diane Stover is your daughter. Yes. Alden said nothing for a moment. Hugh noticed that he did not look angry. He looked like a man who was processing new information carefully. I was parked across the street, Hugh continued. I saw everything. I didn't know you. I didn't know this shop. It was entirely by chance. He paused. But I spent the day after talking to people around this town, and I'd like to show you something. He set the envelope on the desk between them. Alden looked at it, then he opened it. He unfolded the documents inside, the trust papers, the foundation structure, the letters of organization, and then he reached the last page, the certified check. He stopped breathing. His eyes moved over the numbers twice, 3 times. His hands, which could hold a bent connector pin steady without trembling, were not steady now. He looked up $22 million. Yes. There's a mistake. There isn't. Alden set the check down on the desk as if it had become too heavy to hold. Why would anyone? He stopped. Started again. I fixed a laptop, and I didn't even get paid for that. Hugh leaned forward slightly. I'm not giving you this money because of the laptop. I'm not rewarding you for what my daughter did to you, either. He glanced at the photograph of the woman on the shelf. I'm giving it to you because I have spent 3 years trying to find a person worth trusting with it. And in 48 hours, in this town, I found more evidence of that person than I found in 3 years of searching anywhere else. Alden was silent. I have a foundation, Hugh said, fully structured, funded, ready to operate. Its purpose is to help working families, provide vocational training for young people who can't afford college, support veterans, and give single parents access to emergency resources. He paused. What I don't have is the right person to lead it. Someone who understands what it means to actually need help. Someone the community trusts instinctively. Someone whose first response to being disrespected is not retaliation, because that person is going to be making decisions that affect a lot of lives, and the wrong temperament would poison every good thing the money could do. Alden stared at the check. Hugh continued quietly. I heard about the Quincy family, about the school computers, about the fire station, about all of it. He folded his hands. And I heard that when a woman walked out of this shop without paying for work you'd done honestly, you went back to your workbench and kept going. A long silence settled over the small room. From the front of the shop, the bell above the door rang. Alden heard Kit's voice call out. He must have been released early. Some half-day Alden had forgotten. Dad? There are like 5 black cars outside. What's? Kit appeared in the office doorway and stopped. He looked at the man he didn't recognize. He looked at his father. Alden's face was pale in a way Kit had never seen before, and Kit's expression shifted immediately from curious to concerned. Dad, what's wrong? Alden looked at his son for a moment, then something in his face changed, loosened somehow, like a knot coming undone after years of being pulled tight. Nothing's wrong, buddy, he said. His voice was rough at the edges. Come here. Kit came to stand beside him, and Alden put his hand on his son's shoulder. He looked at Hugh. You said it's not charity. It's not. It's an investment in someone who already knows how to do this work. You've been doing it for years, at a loss with your own time, without recognition. Hugh's expression was direct and without sentiment. I'm simply removing the constraint. Outside, the crowd on Merchant Street had grown. Word traveled fast in Dunmore. People were saying Hugh Stover's name in low tones, saying Alden Corby's name in tones that were different. Protective, curious, proud in the way small towns get proud of their own. Inside the office, Alden looked at the check for a long moment. Then he looked at the photograph of Alma on the shelf, where she stood in tall summer grass, laughing at whoever was holding the camera. The $22 million isn't the surprise, Hugh said. The surprise is that after 3 years, I found the person it belongs with. It took 7 days for Diane Stover to drive back to Dunmore. She came alone. No assistant, no car service, no advance call. She parked the Porsche on Merchant Street on a Tuesday afternoon, the same day of the week, the same stretch of curb, and walked into Corby Electronics carrying a small envelope. Alden was at his workbench. He looked up when the bell rang. Diane stood at the counter. She looked different from the last time. Not in her clothes, which were equally precise, but in the line of her shoulders, which were not. She set the envelope on the counter. The invoice, she said, the $340, plus interest, which I calculated at a rate I thought was fair, though you're welcome to tell me it isn't. She paused. And an apology. Alden didn't open the envelope. He looked at her. I measured your value by this building, she said. By what you were wearing. By the assumption that someone in a shop on a side street in a small town couldn't possibly be worth what he was charging. She held his gaze. That was wrong. And I knew it was wrong when I was doing it. I did it anyway. Another pause. I'm sorry. Alden was quiet for a moment. He could have said many things. He was aware of that. He chose what he said carefully, the same way he chose everything, with the understanding that the choice was a small brick in a wall he was always building. Everyone gets chances to be better, he said. You took yours. That's not nothing. Diane nodded once. She turned to leave and then stopped at the door. My father told me something after everything came out, she said. He said he'd been watching me for years, waiting to see if I would eventually become the kind of person who deserved to carry the Stover name. She looked back at Alden. He said he'd seen more of that in one afternoon watching you than he had in years watching me. She left. Alden stood at the counter for a long moment after the door closed. Then he reached up and unpinned the old invoice from the board above the desk. He smoothed it flat, looked at it once, and filed it in the drawer. Not because it no longer mattered, because it had served its purpose. The Walker Community Foundation, he renamed it, and Hugh agreed without argument, opened its doors on the first Thursday of December. The ceremony was simple, which was how Alden wanted it. No stage, no keynote. A room full of people, most of whom had driven from neighboring towns they'd never visited before, most of whom had a reason to be there that had nothing to do with Alden Corby personally, and everything to do with what the foundation represented. Veterans who hadn't had transportation assistance, young people who wanted to learn a trade and couldn't find the money for the training, single parents who had been one car repair or one medical bill away from losing everything, people who were used to looking for help and finding a waiting list. Kit stood beside his father at the entrance when the doors opened. He had not stopped asking questions in the weeks since Hugh's visit, about the foundation, about the work, about how Alden was going to run it. Alden had answered every question honestly, including the ones he didn't fully know the answers to yet. This was new territory. He was going to make mistakes. He said that plainly, and Kit had nodded with the seriousness of someone who appreciated the honesty. Now standing at the door of a building that had once been a closed textile warehouse on the edge of town, watching people file in, Kit said, Dad. Yeah. That woman, Diane. She left without paying because she thought you didn't matter. That's right. But you did matter. You just didn't know how much yet. Alden looked at his son, at the precise, careful face of this boy who was going to become a person his mother would have been astonished by. I think I knew, Alden said. I just couldn't prove it. Kit thought about this, then Mom would have liked today. She would have complained that there weren't enough chairs, Alden said, and then she would have found chairs. Kit laughed, a short, real laugh, the kind that surprised you when it came, and then composed himself. Hugh Stover stood near the back of the room, watching. He had declined the front row. He had declined the mention in the program. He had contributed one thing to this occasion, his name on the founding documents, and his confidence in the man standing at the door. What Alden Corby would build with the foundation over the following years would exceed every projection Grant Faber had put into his initial report. It would reach within 3 years across 6 states. It would put tools in the hands of thousands of people who had never had tools. It would keep families together through crises that, without intervention, would have broken them apart. But none of that was visible yet on that first Thursday in December when the doors opened and people walked in. What was visible was simpler. A man who had been underestimated in his own shop, in his own town on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, who had gone back to work without bitterness, who had raised a son in the same spirit he himself had been shaped by, not the spirit of waiting for fairness, but the spirit of choosing decency when no one was watching and there was nothing to gain. An unpaid invoice of $340 had not broken him. What it had done in the end was find him.